So we're carrying on with our series in Isaiah, which is kind of leading up to Christmas, talking about different prophecies that were made about Jesus. So our passage is Isaiah 42 and it's verses 1 to 4. If you want to find that in a Bible or on a phone or anything like that. I'm actually going to read it twice from two different versions, as it's only 4 verses. I'm going to read from the NIV first and then the NLT. I just think this is one of those passages which it's one of those that sounds beautifully poetic in the NIV version, and we don't want to lose that poetry, but sometimes things sound so poetic we can't actually understand what they're saying, and I think the NLT is a really good translation for keeping some of that poetry but also helping us to understand what is actually being said. As I'm reading it twice, my suggestion would be maybe follow along with one of the times that I read it, and the other time maybe just sit and close your eyes and listen to those words. So the NIV first is Isaiah 42 verses 1 to 4, and it says this: "Here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. He will not shout or cry out or raise his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smouldering wick he will not snuff out. In faithfulness he will bring forth justice. He will not falter or be discouraged till he establishes justice on earth. In his law the islands will put their hope." And then I'm going to read it again. This is the NLT version, the New Living Translation. "Look at my servant whom I strengthen. He is my chosen one who pleases me. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring justice to the nations. He will not shout or raise his voice in public. He will not crush the weakest reed or put out a flickering candle. He will bring justice to all who have been wronged. He will not falter or lose heart until justice prevails throughout the earth. Even distant lands beyond the sea will wait for his instruction." So last week, Mike started this series off for us, and he gave a really, really good and really thorough overview of the context of the book of Isaiah. And if you missed last week, I would really encourage you to go and listen. His sermon is on YouTube, which is how I watched it because I was down with the kids last week. But yeah, if you're interested in that sort of thing, it is a really good explanation. And you know what, even if you weren't there last week, I would advise going and listening again, because I needed to listen twice. There was a lot of information in there, but it was a really, really good and really thorough overview of context. And I just think context of a passage is really, really important for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because it stops us misunderstanding what verses are saying to us. You know, how often do we hear or maybe see on social media a Bible verse quoted completely out of context because it's kind of vaguely applicable to the situation? But if we actually go and read the verses around it, we sometimes discover it's not quite saying what we thought it was saying at all. Context is important to stop us misunderstanding. And it's also really important to help us to understand the depths of what God is saying. You know, how much more powerful does something become? You know, it's very nice to hear something like, "He will bring justice to the nations." That's in verse 1 of our passage today. But how much more powerful does that become when we understand that these people he's speaking to are people in exile who are being oppressed by a foreign power? There's an extra level of understanding from knowing what is happening at this time. And I think when we understand what God is saying to the people of the time, we better understand what he might be saying to us today. So I'm not going to go anywhere near the depth that Mike went into last week because he's already done that, but I'm just going to give a really, really brief overview of the context of this passage because I really do think it's important to help us understand. So Israel are in exile in Babylon. They've had a really long string of bad kings and rulers. There's been a few good ones thrown in as well, but they've just drifted further and further away from God and closer to worshipping idols and the gods of the people around them. God's repeatedly giving them warnings. Sometimes they've repented, but it's not lasted very long. Sometimes they've just ignored God completely. And they've ended up in this situation of being really distant from God. And God has essentially let Babylon come and overthrow them. The remnants of the Israelites have been scattered, or they've been captured and they're working as servants or slaves in Babylon. The first part of Isaiah covers all of the run-up to that, so Israel's sin and what they would need to do to repent. And then chapter 40, the focus kind of shifts to the time when Israel is in exile. And all of the really big questions that arose from that, those kind of questions that arise every time we find ourselves in a rubbish situation. Questions like, has God finally admitted defeat? Have the Babylonians beaten him? Or worse, has Israel's sin finally become too much? Too much for God to handle, or too much for God to bring them back from? And if it's not too much, then what is God's plan? What is God's plan to rescue them from the Babylonians and to rescue them from their own sin? I think Isaiah is one of those books that is a bit impenetrable. It's long, it's complex, it's very, very weird in places. The historical context is not usually immediately obvious when you open it and start reading something. It's kind of difficult, isn't it, to tell which parts are talking about a kind of immediate rescue from the Babylonians and which parts are talking about a future person who's going to come and rescue us all from our sin. And it's also got this mix of literary styles. There's poetry and parables and prophecy and all sorts in there, and it's all jumbled together. And we look at it and think, oh my goodness, I don't really know what's happening there, or at least I do. Not necessarily saying that everybody looks at this book and thinks that, but that's kind of what I think. I look at this book, I think, goodness me, that's long and complicated, and I'm not really sure what that might be saying to me. But if we can get through all of that, what we find is this incredibly beautiful picture of Jesus that's laid out, some 500 to 700 years before he walked on the earth. And it is incredible. I think it's really interesting that we find in the Bible that God tends to reveal parts of his plan and pictures of what Jesus might look like, what he'll be like, precisely when things look really bad for the Israelites. Think back to the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve first sin, and God kind of comes and confronts them about that sin, and he starts talking about the fact that they need to leave the garden. He talks about the fact that life is going to be really hard for them from now on. But at the same time, in the same paragraph, he talks about this descendant of Eve who will one day crush the head of that snake. It's almost the same breath. Your situation is bad, but I have this plan. It's okay. You know, when the situation looked terrible for the Israelites who were slaves in Egypt, way back then when they were captured and oppressed by different nations to the one we're talking about, when the situation looked really bad, when Moses had been to Pharaoh time and time again, when Pharaoh had said no over and over, when they'd faced all of these horrible plagues and things had reached their worst point, the final plague was coming, what do we see in that dreadful situation? This incredible picture of sacrifice and covering of sin that becomes the central festival of the Jewish faith, and that predicts and foreshadows another Passover hundreds of years later, when the ultimate sacrifice to end all sacrifices will take place. When the situation looks really bleak for the Israelites, God reveals a little more of his plan. I think that's amazing. I love that God has this will to bring us hope when the situation looks terrible for us. He sees his people in a dark and difficult situation, and his response to that is to give us hope. I think that's amazing. And here, once again, we find God's people in a dreadful situation. They're captured, they're oppressed, they've lost their home, lots of them would have lost their family. And God reveals more of his plan. He reveals more of a picture of the Saviour who is coming. And I think it's really easy for us to read this and to see Jesus, because we know Jesus, we know the things that he did. But remember, the people at this time didn't really know who they were expecting. Let's have a look at that first verse, shall we? And just try and see it through their eyes as people who had never seen Jesus, who'd never met Jesus, who didn't know what he'd be like. It says, "Look at my servant whom I strengthen. He is my chosen one who pleases me. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring justice to the nations." Now, a servant in this context, it wouldn't have been heard as we hear the word servant, as kind of someone who looks after the house or waits on people. A servant of God in this context would have been a leader, someone who's serving God from that position. Just saying servant would kind of denote any leader, really. Any leader is a servant of God. But the part about God's spirit resting on them, that suggests something more. Only a prophet or the kind of king that King David was would be described like that. And it talks about establishing justice. Establishing justice was the role of a king. That's what kings did. But establishing justice to the nations, are we talking about someone who was going to be king over all of the nations? That is so much more than just a leader of the people. This is a king with a deep connection to God, whose rule is far beyond anything the Israelites would have experienced. I'm going to read that verse again, and then I'm going to read another verse from a different part of the Bible. See if you recognise the second verse that I read. So our verse says, "Look at my servant whom I strengthen. He is my chosen one who pleases me. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring justice to the nations." And the other verse. "At that moment, heaven was opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, 'This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased.'" Do you recognise it? It's from Jesus's baptism. I got that from the book of Matthew. And do you see the similarity between those verses? The chosen one who pleases God, the Spirit upon him. You know, I think that we see these connections kind of back to front because we know Jesus, we know the stories about him, we have those familiar verses kind of stuck in our minds. But how many of us, I certainly can't, can say that we know the books of the Old Testament as well as we know the Gospels? I can't say that. But the Israelites would have. You know, when we read something in Isaiah, for example, we know Jesus and we think, whoa, that's amazing. I know Jesus and I see that this is talking about him. But for the Israelites, it would have been the other way around. Imagine what it would have been like for them. They would have known those verses inside out and back to front. And to see a man standing in front of them, fulfilling those verses, must have been the most incredible experience. I think sometimes we can lose part of the significance of things Jesus did and said because we don't have that same deep knowledge of the Old Testament with all its historical and cultural significance. But that would not have been lost on the Jews who were watching. They would have known those verses and they would have watched with raised eyebrows and open mouths, not just because the dove of God's Spirit was descending and they were hearing this voice from heaven, which frankly is reason enough to raise your eyebrows and open your mouth, I think, but because those verses about the Messiah would have been brought to mind for them. Imagine that experience, being stood there and seeing that. I think verse 2 is a really beautiful picture of Jesus as well. It says, he will not shout or raise his voice in public. This is a leader who doesn't need to shout. He doesn't need to make himself heard because everyone is already listening. He's a leader with authority and confidence. I don't know if you've noticed this, but leaders who have a calm confidence in their own authority never really need to shout. When you speak with confidence and authority, people listen. The leaders who doubt their own authority, who are not confident in their own leadership, those tend to be the ones who go about shouting and making a big scene so that they can be heard. I dare to say we've seen one or two examples of that this week, particularly if you've been following the American election. But Jesus didn't make a fuss. He didn't shout to be heard. In fact, how many times do we see him asking people not to tell what he's done? He doesn't need them to. He doesn't need a propaganda campaign because what he does speaks for itself. And then we come to the second two verses, and they are an incredibly beautiful picture of the character and the leadership of Jesus. They say, he will not crush the weakest reed or put out a flickering candle. He will bring justice to all who have been wronged. He will not falter or lose heart until justice prevails throughout the earth. Even distant lands beyond the sea will wait for his instruction. When I think of those Israelites in exile, far from their home, probably suffering at the hands of the Babylonians, I wonder how many of them felt like a bent, battered reed or a flickering candle. How many of them felt like they were faltering or losing heart. And, you know, when I think of us in lockdown for the second time this year, at the mercy, it seems, of a virus, scared for our own safety, the safety of our loved ones, the safety of our jobs and of our freedom, I wonder how many of us feel like a bent and battered reed. How many of us feel like a flickering candle about to go out? The NIV version doesn't even say that. It says a smouldering wick, no fire left at all. How many of us feel like we're faltering or losing heart? Let these verses be comfort to you, like they were comfort to me this week. There is no flame too small for Jesus to use. No smoulder too small for him to take and protect and gently reignite. No one too crushed or battered or bruised for him to use. You know, one of my favourite stories about Jesus is the one with the loaves and the fishes. Do you know the one? Jesus is speaking to a huge crowd. There's 5,000 men plus women and children. And Jesus has been speaking and teaching them all day, and the people need food. And Jesus' friends come and ask him, they say, what's the plan? And Jesus very nonchalantly says, you go and feed them. Well, they don't have the money or the resources to feed that many people. What they do have is one small boy and his packed lunch, 5 little rolls and 2 fish. And Jesus takes that tiny little offering and turns it into enough food for everyone there. In fact, there's so much food, there's 12 baskets of leftovers. And I wonder how that small boy felt when he was offering his lunch. That tiny little offering to the great teacher who could do miracles was so small and insignificant. One packed lunch offered to the maker of the universe. What did the maker of the universe do with that little offering of a small boy? Brush it aside as insignificant? Kindly say thanks, but no thanks, that's not enough. No, he took that tiny little offering and he made it big. And he didn't just make it big enough, he made it so big it overflowed. Maybe all you have to offer God today is small. Maybe it's something that's bent and battered and bruised. Maybe the heart that you're offering it with has a fire that's about to go out. But there is no person too broken for Jesus. There is no fire too small or too lost for him. And he will take your small offering and make it big. He will transform your words and your actions into something beautiful and special and bigger than you, because that is who he is. And he was always God's plan. Jesus was always God's plan. So I wonder if we can just spend a few minutes quietly offering what we have to God. Maybe what you have is small and insignificant, and you don't feel like it's any use to the maker of the universe. But it is, he values that offering, whatever it is that you have to bring him.